It's a pleasure to welcome to studio Lieutenant Colonel in the Reserves, Jonathan Conricus, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and the former IDF International Spokesperson, Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst and the former Europe and Middle East Editor at the Associated Press, and our Senior Middle East Correspondent, Ariel Oseran. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Dan Perry, your take on exactly that, the strategy being employed right now by the U.S. President.
The Americans are trying to call the Iranians bluff. The idea that Iran is somehow magically and uniquely not susceptible to economic pressure and a total blockade that shuts down 90% of their economy, and by some measures, is astounding, but they are making a good pretense of it. And they're also trying to call a second bluff, which is that the Iranians are indifferent to resumption of the kinetic war and bombardment of their targets and potential attempted assassination of their leaders. We can disbelieve that either of these is true, but they're pretending very hard, and they're famously difficult and talented negotiators. So who knows? It could be that suddenly, in the span of 2 or 3 hours, we find out that indeed a deal is about to be done. But the basic problem is that the Iranians have, I think, been surprised by the effect of the fissures caused in the West by the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. It's become the War of Hormuz. And this has made them very, very brazen. And they're not willing to give the Americans, or the Israelis, obviously, anything. They're not even willing to discuss anything beyond the nukes. And on the nukes, they also seem not willing to give anything, although I suppose that's discussable. I don't think the Americans can return to the status quo antebellum just for an opening of the Strait of Hormuz. And Trump, therefore, is trying to message in every way he can, without upsetting too much his domestic constituencies, that the war might resume, and that if it does, this time it'll be controllable to 2 or 3 weeks, and not to worry, it won't be another 6. I don't think he's playing, however, with a very bad hand, as bad as would appear, and as bad as might have been, given the American miscalculation on the Strait of Hormuz, which I think we have to concede happened. Because the Europeans are feeling a little bit chastened. Not all of them, maybe not Sanchez in Spain, but you hear the constant talk from Mark Rutte and even others in the European Union, Rutte being the head of NATO, saying we've heard it, we've learned our lesson, we have to recalibrate, we'll do more of our part. I think if the war resumes, and this time after what is in fact a war action by Iran against the rest of the world, which is the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz, you'll find a more unified front in the West. Maybe not totally unified, but America may not fully go it alone. And there's a big decision, I'll end with this, on the American side. Are they prepared to let the Iranian regime stay? Let's suppose that the deal put forth by Zawad Zarif in I believe, Foreign Affairs about a month ago, saying we got to do civilian nuclear enrichment, which realistically they kind of have the right to do, under every conceivable verification and so forth. But you got to unblock our assets, you got to let us into the global economy, the banking system, unfreeze the assets, end all sanctions. In other words, give the regime life, sell out the Iranian opposition and protesters. Is America willing to do that for what looks like a plausible, reasonable deal that is a resumption of the JCPOA under some different acronym? And are we willing to let the Iranians get away with business as usual on the proxies, on Hezbollah, on Hamas, on the Houthis? I would actually hope not. But anyone who hopes not has to be willing to risk a resumption of the kinetic war. And that means people here in the studio running for shelter every couple of minutes for a while.
What they're trying to do is change the position of the pieces on the field. That is why we saw them resuming attacks on the UAE, on Oman, trying to bring new pressure on the Trump administration to end the blockade. But I think they're pressuring the wrong sides, because if they're thinking that attacking the UAE is going to make them ask Trump to stop the war, that is the opposite effect of what they're doing.
Brief reaction.
Well, I agree. The UAE may look like the weak link, but in fact, they have been most vocal in asking for the war to continue, and probably they'll double down because of this. I was going to say one other thing in terms of the pieces on the chessboard. There is a massive wave of assassinations in Iran. But that resulted in a more hardline leadership. There is a question of who's in charge. Who appears to be in charge of the war strategy and negotiation strategy is hardliners in the IRGC, who effectively staged what you could call a quiet coup. a resumption of the war will probably see an effort to remove that entire cadre in hopes that the third cohort of Iranian leadership would be relative moderates like Pezeshkian, the president, essentially.
Relative moderates, relative indeed.
Highly
Gentlemen.
relative.
I think looking at the bigger picture here, I think the Emiratis have taken very interesting and bold steps in the region in terms of their posture, in terms of their political statements, the decision to leave OPEC, which is very spiteful and I think strategically very important, are decisions that at face value bring the UAE closer to the US and by a certain extent of that also to Israel. It could also be that they're just the first to recognize new trends and are getting out of OPEC for other economic reasons. But you could also think about what is the future of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. What is the future of the Arab League? These are two organizations that once, at least the Arab League, had power and influence, but today largely insignificant as Arab countries are being attacked by another Muslim country, and they've done nothing really important to deal with it. So there are interesting big pieces at play here. I think Israel is going to emerge a strong winner from this situation, whether or not the Iranian regime is actually taken off and finished. Israel will emerge stronger in the region, kind of a mirror image to the situation that we see in Europe and the West, where unfortunately Israel is receding a bit in the local area. I think Israel will strengthen itself.
Parting thoughts on that, Dan Perry, 30 seconds.
It's very interesting that Israel and the UAE are becoming so close. Clearly, as Jonathan said, these steps are very dramatic. It would be unfortunate if this move to attach Saudi Arabia more to Qatar and to Turkey actually works. It's hard to believe because that's fundamentally, despite Qatar's status as an ally of the U.S., it's an anti-American, anti-Western move. It may be posturing by Saudi Arabia that wants certain things from the West, and all of this frisson may be a function of the current agitation in Iran. I have to think if the Iranian regime magically falls by the end of the year, everything may roll back, and as Jonathan says, Israel will be a very major winner in such a scenario.
We wait to see how it all unfolds, changing dynamics indeed.